A cry for help for the people of Syria. The UN's humanitarian chief says 40% of the population is now in desperate need of assistance, and their plight is only getting worse. 2.5 years on, what hope is there for those caught up in the conflict? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Dareen Abughaida. The United Nations is warning that the humanitarian crisis in Syria is deteriorating rapidly. It estimates that more than 9 million people are now in need of help, and that's 40% of the population. But the delivery of aid has slowed to a trickle, and there are reports that do suggest there has been little help for many in need for almost a year. The UN says the number of people displaced from their homes has risen to 6.5 million, many living without adequate food or access to electricity or medical supplies. More than 2 million have fled the country, seeking refuge in Lebanon, Jordan and Turkey, Iraq, as well as Egypt. And since the unrest began in March 2011, more than 100,000 people are estimated to have been killed. While the 15-member UN Security Council approved a statement in October calling for increased humanitarian assistance, but it was non-binding, and humanitarian chief Valerie Amos said it had little impact on the ground.
I expressed to the Council my deep disappointment that the progress that we had hoped to see on the ground as a result of that statement has not happened, and in fact what we are seeing is a deepening of the crisis, more and more people affected, and in particular my worries about the extremely brutal and violent nature of this conflict.
Well, Syria's ambassador to the United Nations has said that Syria has done its part to help humanitarian aid workers on the ground, although he did admit that visas are limited and not granted to all groups that request access.
We are issuing too many visas to too many people. We are a sovereign nation, like any other nation. We have our own reasons sometimes to deny visa to this individual or to that individual. This is an integral part of the principle of sovereignty of any member state in the United Nations.
And while all of this was going on, the World Health Organization has confirmed Syria's first outbreak of polio since 1999. Valerie Amos is now calling on the Security Council to use its influence over those parties that can ensure the safe passage of medical personnel and supplies, and the safe and unhindered delivery of humanitarian assistance, the protection of civilians, and who can help expand critical life-saving relief operations. Well, the latest figures that we're telling you about the number of people in need of assistance are coming from the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, and their spokesman, Jens Laerke, is joining me now from Geneva to discuss these figures. Jens, thanks for being with us on Inside Story. So it's 9.3 million people that need assistance, 40% of the population, but what's really striking, I think, is that the rate, this figure has actually risen by 2.5 million since September.
Yes, the figures are staggering. It's catastrophic. The numbers continue to rise. Now, when we have reached this very high figure, if we compare to the previous figures that went out in June, when we were talking about 4.2 million people displaced inside the country. It is not one event that has triggered this. It's a continuation of conflict. It's a continuation of the displacement that has now brought us to this horrific number.
You talk about the continuation of the displacement and so forth, but can you give us exact examples of why the numbers are increasing so drastically and so rapidly?
Well, numbers are increasing, and we have said that many times from the beginning of the conflict 2.5 years ago, when we saw the first displacement also crossing borders into Turkey, for example. Now, this has grown exponentially. Now, this is a result of the ongoing fighting that continues, and the effect of that fighting between several groups and government forces.
Jens, is it possible to pinpoint where the biggest deterioration is? For example, I mean, you hear reports from both the government sides as well as the armed faction sides who say either side is restricting access to humanitarian aid and assistance and to international organizations. I mean, is the biggest deterioration, can you say whether it's in government-held territory or rebel-held territory?
Well, it is in several places across the country. Now, we have regular programs delivering humanitarian aid, and we have access to quite a large number of people. For instance, last month, there was food aid delivered to over 3 million people inside of Syria. There are other areas, basically disputed or contested areas, where it's very, very difficult for us to access. Now, we do manage to access these people. We do that through convoys. We've had this year alone more than 30 convoys going into opposition-controlled areas and to areas under dispute. It's far from enough. We would like, of course, to see much more aid going in. And the bottom line is that we need unhindered humanitarian access to every single person inside Syria who is in need of aid.
Okay, and let's pinpoint exactly what the aid is that is needed. I mean, the humanitarian crisis seems to have affected all sectors. Is that right?
That is correct. And we speak about millions and very big numbers. Now, behind all these figures are real people. It's real men, it's women, it's children, it's the elderly, it's babies, it's people with illnesses. It's a cross-section of the population who need aid, and that's important to keep in mind. That these are the people, those are civilians that we are trying to help. Now, they need at this point, after this long being in an increasingly disastrous situation, they need a lot of different kinds of aid in order to survive and in order to sustain their life and having some resemblance of normality. So that they need food, they need clean water for drinking, their children need vaccinations, their children also need education, they need medical help, and they need medical services.
Jens, there was a non-binding statement by the UN last month for humanitarian access as well as aid. I'm sure you're very aware of it, but it seems, I mean, according to these latest figures put out by you, that's the humanitarian situation does continue to worsen. Why, in your opinion, is there little resolve, it seems, from the UN to tackle this problem? And why put out a non-binding statement?
Well, the Security Council put out a presidential statement, which is an expression, if you like, of the international humanitarian community urging the parties on the ground to give us the access that we need to help people in need. Now, this is more than a month since this was done. We have not detected a lot of improvement on the ground. The Undersecretary General has said that she was disappointed about what she had seen. So obviously it is for the parties on the ground to implement these provisions that the Security Council has laid out.
Okay, Jens, thank you. That's Jens Laerke from the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs speaking to us from Geneva. Thank you. Well, let's bring in our other guests now. From the Jordanian capital, Amman, we have Peter Kessler. Peter's the regional spokesman for the UN's refugee agency, the UNHCR. And joining us via Skype from Damascus is Khaled Erksoussi. He's head of operations for the Syrian Arab Red Crescent. Very good to have you with us, gentlemen, on Inside Story. Peter, we were just talking about with Jens the number of people that actually need humanitarian assistance in Syria, 40% of the population. But there are, in fact, millions of others who are beyond the reach of UN agencies.
Well, indeed, there are many people inside Syria in hard-to-reach areas where conflict is still going on, where it is difficult to reach them. But UNHCR, our partner agencies, we are getting aid through to many of those people who've been caught up in the conflict and or otherwise can't get aid. But indeed, it's very, very difficult, as you noted in your earlier conversation, to get aid into all areas of the country, because, of course, we're reliant upon the goodwill and access being granted by all the parties to the conflict.
Khaled, how difficult is it to actually get aids into the country?
It's not difficult to get the aid in the country if the aid was coming enough. The main challenge we are facing on the ground, that the aid from outside through our partners is not enough for the need on the ground. As your guest said, now we estimate the number of more than 6 million people internally displaced. Yet we are still receiving aid only enough for 2.5 million people to be distributed each month. That leaves a gap of more than 50% or 60% of the people who are not receiving anything until now. This is one of the challenges. Of course, the other challenge, as you mentioned and as others mentioned, is the access. We can, with our partners, access around 80% of the areas inside Syria. That leaves 15% of the people that cannot be reached, cannot be accessed. And for that, we are reaching out for all the parties carrying guns and arms to let humanitarian, agencies access to those people.
And your efforts to do so, how have they gone?
Well, until now, of course, it depends on the areas. We can reach areas even under opposition control, like Raqqa, like Azor, like north of Aleppo. Our branches and sub-branches are still operating in those areas. Even, for instance, in Raqqa, we are still operating under Nusra. In Azor, we are still operating under different groups. We negotiate with them the terms of reference. We say we must be able to reach and distribute transparently to all the people in need. We will not favor anybody and any relatives of any armed group or any person over the need. And the convoys are still reaching there. Unfortunately, areas sometimes nearer to Damascus, like south of Ghouta and like the famous Mu'addamiyya, we were not able to access it due to the ongoing conflict going on. We tried to ask for a ceasefire. We tried to do a lot of things. We were able to, for instance, to say that cannot reach if help cannot reach the people, let the people reach the help. And we facilitated the exit of around 4,000 people from Mu'addamiyya to two safe shelters in surrounding Damascus.
Peter, there is, of course, the very real issue of displacement. I mean, when we talk about a number of 6.5 million Syrians displaced, what exactly does that mean?
I mean, we're talking about a middle-income country, a country that was highly developed, which is now, of course, has lost much of its industrial base. Its infrastructure largely lies in ruins. More than 5,500 schools have been seriously damaged or destroyed. Some 3,000 mosques. Some 15,000 doctors and surgeons are now out of the country. 60% of the ambulances inside Syria have been destroyed or are no longer functioning. So we're seeing at all levels of life inside the country, the healthcare system, the education system, the infrastructure, the business system. The country is fast collapsing. It's driving some 6.8 million people to flee their homes. And of course, outside the country, we already have some 2.2 million refugees. So displacement is a major problem. And
Right.
of course, many of these people who are displaced are poised to cross borders into neighboring countries.
Here's the thing, though, Peter. You just mentioned the 2.2 million that have registered in neighboring countries, but those are the ones that have registered. What about the ones that have not registered? Any figures on those? Any estimates?
Well, it's difficult to say, but we estimate that perhaps, up to 300 to perhaps 600,000 or more people may be unregistered in neighboring countries like Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan. The governments in these countries give even larger figures. It's difficult to know, of course, when some people may not want to come forward. They may not want to identify themselves as refugees. But what we saw in the past years since the Iraq crisis broke out 10 years ago, that people do cross borders. They don't all come forward. We expect the same to be true in this case, that many people may not come forward, but now we're seeing a crisis enduring. And of course, it may be that many of these tens, these hundreds of thousands of people will register themselves soon, and that will only add to the crisis, because now we see up to some 40% of Syria's population, more than 9 million people in need of aid, victims of the conflict, and that doesn't count, of course, the people who have already crossed the borders. So this is a major crisis which is unprecedented in certainly modern time.
And Peter, as well as Khaled, speaking of unprecedented, in fact, before the conflict in Syria, an estimated 95% of children under 5 were vaccinated against polio, and the disease had been wiped out. But now, speaking of unprecedented, that safety net has been broken. At least 10 children have tested positive for polio in the eastern province of Deir ez-Zor. Another 12 are suffering from paralysis. Now, polio has been eradicated in many parts of the world, and it's not been seen in Syria since 1999. And health officials are worried the outbreak could spread and cross to neighboring countries such as Iraq and Lebanon, which are overwhelmed by refugees. Khaled, which I'll ask you about the risk of polio spreading to other countries, but tell us about Syria right now. Are you hearing of any new polio cases, and where did it start? Where did polio come from?
Well, according to our information, the first cases are near Deir ez-Zor and near Mayadeen. The virus tested obviously indicates that it's coming from outside. People say that tests are indicating that it's coming from parts of Pakistan, maybe towards Syria. Syria had no polio since the last case was in 1999. This is the first time that we have polio. This is due to the broken chain of vaccination that happened due to the conflict. Now we are in the process of course, the Red Crescent is always running vaccination campaigns, but now we are going to run a nationwide vaccination campaign with the help of WHO and in coordination, of course, with the local authorities. We are trying to say that draw a map and say that okay. The Syrian Ministry of Health should take care about the areas they can access, and we will take care of the areas that they cannot access. But of course, facilitation for our access must be provided by all parties, so our teams could access those areas to deliver the medicines and the vaccinations to our branches and some branches, and they will carry on this vaccination.
When you speak of facilitation, how's it been?
Well, the facilitation until now, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. We are trying to convince that all parties that vaccination, of course, that first the illness cannot be detained by checkpoints. It knows no borders, so you cannot stop the illness at some point by your checkpoints. And for that, you must let us go into places and vaccinate everybody, because if we don't do that, it will spread to everywhere. And it doesn't what do you call it, jeopardize anything. Vaccinations doesn't support people who are carrying arms or people who are not carrying arms. It's just for the children. So it must be something that all parties agree upon.
Peter, do you think that is something that all parties agree upon? I mean, is it on the priority list right now of the government as well as the rebels to go ahead with this vaccination program? And also talk to us about the real concern, as Khaled was saying, that it actually can spread to other countries in the region, not only polio, but other diseases that there could be an outbreak of.
You're absolutely right, of course. Before the conflict, some 95% of the children were vaccinated against polio. That's declined. Together with our partners, we're having to quickly vaccinate the children arriving. We have some 2,000 to 3,000 people arriving every day from Syria in the refugee camps across the region. So we're having to institute polio vaccination campaigns to ensure or to forestall the spreading of polio. Other illnesses like leishmaniasis and a serious skin problem, and of course other illnesses can spread when you have a population on the move. So it's clear that we work with countries to ensure that public health systems are established in the host countries, but likewise inside Syria. The parties on the ground, the government, the opposition, must realize that aid has to be allowed through, and they must also get this message from their supporters abroad. Many of these parties on the ground are getting aid assistance from outside the country. The message worldwide has to be that the civilians should be spared, that international humanitarian law must be respected, and that the children, the women, the elderly, all the civilians on the ground need access to food, to health care, to medicines. Children have a right to go to school. This message has to be drummed through to everybody that the conflict must end.
Right. Well, let me ask you this then, Peter. Why do you think that there was such quick resolve to get the chemical weapons inspectors into Syria? There was an agreement by the international community. And when it comes to humanitarian aid and assistance, it's just not, it doesn't seem to be the same kind of resolve.
Well, clearly, of course, the scourge of chemical weapons has to be wiped from the face of the earth. But indeed, of course, the abuse of human rights, I don't think it's really appreciated how every single refugee who crosses a border, each one of those families has a story of persecution, of conflict, abuse, and that's just not for the 2.2 million refugees outside, but for the some 6.8 million displaced people, according to OCHA's provisional figures, who are displaced inside the country. Each one of these millions of people has seen their home damaged or destroyed. They may have seen a member of their family killed. They've been caught up in the war, or they've become deeply impoverished by the conflict, the enduring crisis, the collapse of the country's economy, and it's frankly frightening that some people say that most civil wars last up to 15 years. We're seeing a country that is fast on its way back to a situation not seen in many dozens, if not many more years, where they could soon be back in an era of 19th century conditions. And this has to be stopped by the parties on the ground and by those people supporting them outside.
And Khaled, when Peter refers to those people supporting them outside, any ideas on how to be able to shift the priorities and shift gears a little bit?
Well, let me tell you, it was shocking to us after this chemical weapons use here that the international community went after the murderer and forgot the victim. In the Security Council decision was to allow the inspectors to go, nothing to mention about the first aid teams to go inside that day to save who has been left alive of those people. This is what we are trying to say. Don't mix the humanitarian issues with the politics. Politics is dirty. And we want that, okay, it's good that we are raising the noise about the humanitarian need, but at some point we need to fulfill this need. It's not enough that we make a big noise about the need and we demand things, and here at the ground level, here we are at the front line, we don't have enough material left to distribute. We are knocking on every door now for access. But now, if I have all the access in the world, really I will be embarrassed. I don't have enough material to distribute it to other places. If now somebody now tell me, here you go, you can go to everywhere you go from now on, my warehouses are empty. So for that, we are calling that, yes, it's good to raise the attention of the access, but it's also be better that I have the material, we receive the material through our donors, through our partners, the UN agencies, the International Red Cross and Red Crescent national societies. And
so what you're saying is, Khaled, briefly, is that you're definitely falling short of all of the donations that have been pledged.
Yes, we are always in need. Not a single month comes by and the plan is fulfilled, and we are always told by the partners who are giving us aid that their donors are not paying enough.
Right.
So there's always a shortage in this.
Okay, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much. That's Khaled Erksoussi as well as Peter Kessler joining us on Inside Story. Thank you. And thanks. Earlier we had as well Jens Laerke out of Geneva. Well, for our viewers, you can find this story and many more at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, and you can always leave us your comments there as well. Thanks very much for watching. From me and the whole team, goodbye for now.